it's wonderful to have you all here on this panel today, all about raising your first round. So just to introduce myself, first of all, I'll be moderating the panel. My name is Naomi. I am co-founder of Thyia. We're creating the comfortable and convenient alternative to the smear test. For myself, I'm very much in the same position as lots of you, where I am in the process of just starting to look at raising our first round. We've actually been very fortunate and won a couple of grants from Innovate UK, so that's really kickstarted our journey, and I know there'll be lots of other journeys from different people here today. Now, I'm accompanied by three wonderful panelists. So the first one is Alice. So Alice is a principal at a venture capital company. She invests in early stage women's health companies across life science, digital health, and consumer. We also have Lara, who was a sort of cohort member with me of FemTech Lab, so we know each other very well, and it's great to be able to have you here. So she is the co-founder of Happy Sneeze, and you'll hear a little bit more about Happy Sneeze later in this panel. And then finally, we have Alex, who is the founder and CEO of Maroo. Alex has raised $3.8 million for his fintech startup, which is quite incredible, all at about the wedding industry, and has pitched to more than 260 investors to get his first commitment from angels before being accepted into Y Combinator. So it's an incredible group of people, from startups to sort of building companies, to Alice from a venture capital perspective. So Alice, I'm going to turn to you first of all, and to really kick this off, as somebody who invests in early stage women's health companies, it'd be really wonderful if you can kick this off by sharing some of the key traits that you look for in a femtech startup when sort of considering that first round of investment.
Sure. And maybe I'll just start by saying, before we think about fundraising, we should just all acknowledge that it's a very difficult time for founders, for funds. 2 years ago, we were in a bit of a heyday. There was a lot of free flowing capital from LPs to funds, from funds to startup. And we're definitely in a contraction right now. If you look at any of the stats and PitchBook or other sources, the amount of venture funding, in this past quarter, half year has a lot lower than it has been in the past couple of years. So for all the founders out there, you may hear more no's, things may take a longer time. Be kind to yourself, because a lot of that is likely driven by the market environment. In fact, there's a really great article in Health Tech Nerds about this. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's something where there was a survey done collecting founder experiences. And it was actually really tactically helpful. People talked about how long things took and what it was like, and then also just emotional support for each other, because it is difficult. So that all said, I'm happy to answer the question, which is, what are the key traits we look for in the first round investment? And I would say, this is not any different from looking at a non-women's health company. So, it's very kind of standard, typical venture and innovation types of things. The other caveat I'll give is that there are differences between life science companies and I was just maybe bucket is all other. So digital health, health services, consumer health, et cetera. And that's just because the emphasis at the early stage, life science companies are in R&D phase, then there's many more questions about the science and, evidence base. Whereas for the all other group, most likely have potential to commercialize much faster. And so we'll be looking at different things. But the broad buckets, I would say first and foremost is, what is a problem that you are solving? What is there significant need, both, from a clinical perspective or, customer, dissatisfaction, how big is the market size? And then the other really important thing, which is so core to a company and a fundraise that sometimes you don't see very clear, is what what is your actual product or solution? Don't have it at the very end. Don't have it too scattered, like just upfront. Here's a problem and here's how we're solving it. That is, I would say those are the two most important things. And then everything else that's, again, typical of what any VC would look for in any company. What's your business model, as in how will you get customers and who is paying for your service? Is it out of pocket? Is it paid by employers or government, et cetera, business model. And then, traction and milestones. What kind of evidence do you have? How much have you scaled? Don't forget competition. Sometimes we have a whole pitch meeting and there's not a competition slide, no mention of that. That's not possible. There must be something. So tell us what your thoughts are so we see how you understand the environment. And of course, team. But I'll pause there. I talk for, it's a lot of things to think about.
There are lots. And do you find that there's sort of differences in what you look for in that first meeting, which is obviously usually quite informal, versus a pitch deck that maybe is being sent as a cold email with an attachment? What do you find with the differences between those and what you're looking for?
Yeah. I think there's actually multiple questions and layers embedded there. There's one thing about what is the process, for fundraising, and I'm sure some of the other panels can speak to this as well in terms of generating a target list and then getting introductions. With the introductions, you might send a teaser pitch deck, and then you have a first meeting. So there's a whole art to the process. In terms of first meeting versus pitch deck, I would say most of the time, pitch decks, we see a lot of them as that teaser pitch deck, before we've talked to the company, maybe we're screening it from a cold inbound or from an introduction or our pitch portal, actually. That type of pitch deck is usually shorter, and I just need to very quickly understand what's the problem you're addressing and what is your solution, and the other things as well. But I first and foremost need to know, like, what is your company all about? And then, in that first meeting, we want to go much more into detail about all of the different components we mentioned. I have some thoughts as well on how to run the first meeting, but perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, let's get to that. I think it'd be really great to hear, Laura, a bit about your fundraising journey and getting to that point so far with Happy Sneeze.
Yeah, thanks. I think something to be said here is that we talk about the first round. I think it will be exceptional that the first round is actually funded by somebody like Alice. Normally, if you're a digital health company or almost like any other company, your first round may come from friends and family or angel investors, not from a VC. So we raised $250,000 at the very end of 2021, and that came from 19 people we knew or who knew somebody we knew, and checks went from $2,000 to $30,000. And I, like, in my time in the startup ecosystem, I think that's kind of common. However, I think it's important to look at this first round professionally. So you don't want to just like ask for money to your friends. I have these like three things, right? Like mindset, instrument, and hustle. So mindset, like you want to be ready for asking the people around you to invest with you, right? You're the primary investor. You probably put your job to do these. You're taking the risk, and then you want to go out and pitch these. They will be the first ones that will be hearing about it, and they will be sharing the risk with you. So you want to be professional about it and know what are you going to use that money for. The second thing is instrument, and I feel like so fortunate somebody told me about this. So you just don't want to take money from people and hand them over like a percentage of your company, kind of like, I'll give you 1% or I'll give you 5%. That's really random, right? There's ways that work to do that first round. We use what's called a convertible note, which basically allows you to not have to have a valuation on the company, because who knows what a very, very early stage company is worth. And the other thing is that we syndicate it. And what that means is that you get all your small investors under one company, and it is that company that invests in you. And what that does is that keeps your cap table very, very clean. And that makes it a lot more attractive for investors that come later, like Alex, right? So I was lucky enough that an angel investor who didn't invest in us explained me all this and hooked me up with a company that actually helped us do that. So that's really helped us down the road. And then finally, the hustle. So when you're dealing with so many small investors in this first round, you really have to be on top of things. So you will have to be calling everybody, asking for signatures, asking for transfers. So just be ready to spend, like a month and a half just on the phone, chasing people, WhatsApping people, so that all the money ends up in your bank account.
I mean, that's incredibly helpful. And I think it's so important thinking about that process and the approach there. And Alex, I know that for yourself, you obviously pitched this large number of investors to get your first yes, which allowed you to kind of catapult forward. It would be really amazing to hear about how you kind of systemize that process before you even get to the cap table. Are you able to talk about that, Alex?
Sure, absolutely. So basically, first of all, before you go fundraising, you need to make sure you have clear understanding what you're fundraising for. Because in many cases, I saw founders just going out there and saying like, all right, we're going to raise, I don't know, $1 million. And, one of the questions that, I was asked is like, how do you want to spend those funds? And you need to have very clear understanding what type of goal or what goal you're raising it for. So let's assume you understood the goal and you understand like the purpose and how you're going to spend it. So now you need to understand like what type of outreach you want to do. And investor outreach, it's no different, frankly, than sales, any type of sales. So it's top of the funnel, and then like different steps from, cold email, then first call, second call, presentation, investment committee, and so on. And one of the things I did, I was just literally, created like a small CRM for myself, where I just was adding like all investors whom I was either introduced, I found on the web, and so on, and just like ran it through the whole kind of process. And the more methodic, it means the more structured and organized like you are in your process, because there is like nothing exciting in terms of like having an investor or like a lead, customer lead, and like just moving them along the way through your funnel. To your point, yes, I did have quite a lot of investor meetings, because wedding vertical, it's not very, like, I would say, common industry that investors saw exits in the past 20 years, frankly. So it wasn't as appealing, and it took me quite a while to show the potential and the benefits and opportunities there, which is why it took such a long time and so many people. I'm sure this number varies between startups. Don't take my kind of number as an example or something. At the same time, when I just started, I was told you need to have a list of 300 investors at least, in order, like in the top of your funnel, in order to get to like at least 10 in the end with whom you can have a like decent conversation, or like a conversation about like decision making for an investment. And it's pretty much like was kind of like similar to what I experienced. I would say it started maybe like from 10,000 emails, 1,000 emails, and then ended up at around 250 calls. And our first round for 700K, we closed with, I believe, 20 investors, 20 angels. Mm-hmm. And to Laura's point, I would highly encourage everyone to first bring angels on board in your very first round, because of the following reason. Like, you need to create social buzz about you as a company. Because like this is something I underappreciated at the beginning of our journey. The fact that once the person, like an angel, puts money in your company, then they go to the bar and they talk there with their friends and saying, "Oh, I just invested in such a cool company." Their friends become interested, and they are like, "Oh, can I do the same? Because hey, I believe what you're doing, and like I trust you." And that's how, for example, we got our first angel for 25K, and then he brought another 5 of his friends for another 25K each. That quickly, expanded like quite fast. So it made things relatively easier. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like organization, treat it as a sales process. Yeah. And in terms of like where I guess to look for investors, in Europe, there are quite a lot of databases where, where you can like find in open sources like the information about who invests in which companies. Crunchbase and PitchBook are good resources as well. And obviously, FemTech Lab, it's a great opportunity to meet, not just like every investor, but like investors who are focused on your topic or on your vertical, which makes it easier for you, frankly, like qualify potential, people whom you're going to speak with. Because sometimes, investors approach you and saying like, we are industry agnostic. And sometimes it means they just, they don't have like much expertise. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's so cool, to have, companies like, or accelerators like FemTech Lab, because they help you as a startup to narrow that funnel, like to specifically who you need to talk. And it's great to have, Edis as a great representative of this group.
No, absolutely. And I completely agree. We've found the same at Thyia, where through something like FemTech Lab, where you build a relationship, if you can get one angel, even if that angel doesn't invest in you, who kind of believes in your mission or says from a different area but has connections, then suddenly having somebody give referrals that is a direct referral rather than a cold outreach definitely makes a huge impact into that relationship and likeliness of it succeeding. Laura, I know for yourself, you've spoken lots in kind of presentations in the past about the fact that despite covering half of the population, femtech is sometimes seen as this niche area. It's rather bizarre. And therefore, when you're trying to look at investors often say, oh, it's not my industry, it's not my area. It'd be really amazing to hear about how you communicated your message when speaking to angels and investors, and whether you saw any difference there between VCs versus angels versus family and friends.
Yeah, that's a great question. The niche, right? Well, I need to diversify. I'm already invested and it's 2 companies. Oh my God. Anyway, so I think the way around we found is using data. So we use prevalence data, so how big the disorder is and how many people are affected by it. Cost, so how expensive is it for the women who suffer it and also for health systems. And then what's the business case for health systems and payers. That's how you kind of remove the biases and judgments that you may get from people who are not close to the issue. And I guess that would probably apply to anyone pitching to someone who doesn't have the depth in whatever industry. I can see Alex pitching wedding industry to people who have no idea, right? So he was probably suffering from the same. So yeah, definitely using data. And some people may not get it, and that's okay. You won't be liked by everybody. And I like what Alice said, right? Just be kind to yourself. Not everyone may be a good target. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alice, I'm going to come back to that point you were raising about running that first meeting. So if, say, you've managed to find somebody, you've built up enough of a connection to get a meeting, what are your kind of recommendations for running that, what you should and shouldn't do?
Yes, and happy to share and just be super practical. I will say, every investor, every fund will have different preferences. So I'm speaking really from kind of my experience, having like hundreds and hundreds of, first pitches, but hopefully some of this will be applicable to others as well. So when I think about it, even let's just say, you're setting up the first meeting, 30 minutes is usually good, especially if you don't have any crazy in-depth science. Maybe you can go to 45 or 60 if there's a lot of technical detail. But a lot of investors, they really like to keep that kind of first meeting short, just figure out if it's a good fit, and then you can always invest more time. If you can, send the pitch deck in advance. Don't expect a deep read, but it is nice sometimes for investors just to glance at it so they know what they're walking into, and they might have targeted questions. Okay, so now you have the meeting on the calendar. I would suggest first having the investor introduce him or herself and the fund. That way you know where this person's coming from. Do they have a deep technical background? So you can, not talk too much about not have to go in more detail, or you may want to go into more detail there. Also, what's the fund focus area and what incoming questions might they have, so you know where you want to double down and focus a little bit more. So ask for them to introduce themselves, then introduce yourself, and especially if you have a personal tie to what problem you're solving, or there's something creative about the name of the company, share that. It's a really great way to kind of build a personal connection and be memorable. And then you can go through your deck, and I would frame it as this is it's a conversational. Please stop at any time. Let's deep dive. Let's have have that Q&A throughout. Because what happens sometimes is, what I've seen is there are some companies that they get on the phone, they resume and don't do any don't ask any question about the funds. They have no idea what the fund's thinking, and then introduce themselves very briefly, and then just kind of go through the presentation as if they're giving a lecture in school, right? And then go all the way to the very end, and then there's no time left for questions, and the investor's thinking, or me, I guess, in this situation, I have all these other questions. I don't know what your round is about, but we're out of time. So I would suggest being, again, doing the intros, be conversational, figure out like where should you speed up, where do you want to slow down to hit on certain points, invite the questions, and then always leave time at the end for questions, in both directions, because it's not just a one-way screening process. You are also assessing about this fund. Is this a fund you would want on your cap table? What questions are they asking? What is their process? So, it's hard to do all of that in 30 minutes. So there's certainly an art to it. But those are just some practical tips from lots of pitches I've had.
Oh no, it's incredibly useful. And I think, as you said, having that conversational element rather than going in and trying a hard sell for a first conversation. I think it's like any relationship. Someone once said to me, it's like dating. You don't go in with marriage from the beginning. It's building up that softer relationship, building up a personal relationship, showing why you're somebody that investor would want to work with. Are there any kind of key and common pitfalls that you see from investors, particularly if it's their first round, they're new to venture capital, or even like investment as a whole? What are those common pitfalls that you see?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, all of that discussion about how to run the first meeting, that's really a process type of suggestion. And if I just take a step back, I would say there's a strategy question is there's many types of capital, and is venture capital right for you right now? I feel like there's a lot of, pressure and some FOMO about, my friends raising, and this is a VC-backed company and I'm hearing all this in the news. I should go get venture capital funding, but just take a pause first and understand, what is venture capital? What are the expectations that come with that in terms of growth, profitability, future exit potential, and lots of governance. Taking venture capital means that you could get replaced as a CEO at some point in the future. It means that you have a board that will include your investors, and so there's a little bit of a loss of governance. Of course, with that, there's hopefully is value. Venture capitalists, they want a lot of early stage ones. They want to work closely with the companies. There's coaching and expertise, so there's lots of positives. But it is a question worth considering before jump in and decide this is definitely what you want, because there's bank loans, there's crowdfunding, there's bootstrapping, there's self-funding. There's lots of perfectly profitable, sustainable, high impact companies that can sustain themselves and do not need or are not appropriate for venture funding. Because again, it comes with this expectation of how you're going to grow and getting to exit. That's kind of one thing that I just want to lay it out before we all barrel down the path of VC.
No, absolutely. And I think one more question on this topic, because I think it was definitely a big learning for myself. Are there any big pitfalls as you talk about that governance side when it comes to things like required services like legals and the data room when applying for your first round? Do you see any big mistakes or pitfalls in that area from startups?
Sorry, what do you mean by required services?
So things like having, I learned for ourselves that initially everything, all of the creative and IP was assigned to us as people. And a lawyer was like, no, it has to be assigned to the company. I was like, that's a learning, something we didn't know, quickly implemented. And there were lots of small wins like that that we had to implement. So, I mean, things like legal requirements or documentation requirements?
Got it. Yeah. And those type of things will definitely come up, in the diligence process. Funds will definitely be looking at the IP situation. It doesn't apply to every company, but to some, it does. And your other question you mentioned around the data room. Not every company has a data room off the bat. Sometimes it's offered even after the first meeting. Some companies are very open Komodo about it, and others will ask for an NDA. Actually, here's one thing to consider is I actually would advise against an NDA if you can, especially if you're not a life science company with like super proprietary science. And that is because it can deter some investors from looking, depending on how expansive the NDA scope is and the duration of coverage. And if you're asking for an NDA for your financial projections, that's probably just not a great idea in general. But if you have science that, where it comes down to understanding the actual target or the actual mechanisms that would make you more comfortable, just make sure it's scoped narrowly enough that it doesn't prevent the investor from talking to other companies, not about your information, but just talking to other companies in general, so that you still keep that wide funnel. As others have mentioned, you need a wide top of funnel.
That's super helpful for myself, and I'm sure everybody on this chat. Alex, I'm going to come to you now and just speak about where those conversations don't go right or dealing with the wrong person, and kind of how you manage to deal with rejection there, because I think it's really inspirational how you pushed forward through that, and then the investment that you got and the growth after that one yes, and how you managed to keep yourself motivated until you found the right angel to kickstart that journey.
Yeah, it was frankly a very interesting kind of experience, because I never heard so many no's in such a jammed period of time. And it's also, it's not like really a no. People will always say something like, it's not the right time, or maybe not the best fit. So it wouldn't be like a straight no. Sometimes people just don't respond at all. But it's fair to say that, yeah, it was a lot of rejection in a very condensed period of time. In terms of how to deal with this, my recommendation will be just believe in like what you're building and why you started it. Because in my case, I was doing like full-time job in parallel, then we have kids, and then I was like pitching from literally the same place as I'm here right now at home, because I started the company during pandemic. So I think my kids and Kate, my wife, they were able to pitch Maroo to anyone, like after hearing me so many times doing this. And again, I guess like the main way to persevere in this case is just go back to the origins, like why you started it, and being very frank. If you decided to do a startup for the money, your motivation will disappear very quickly, because I can tell you on the spot, there will be so much more other ways to make more money than like starting your own company. So it should be something like, the problem you're trying to solve, it touched you in some way, right? Or the product you're building, or the people you're building the product for, like you have some attachment. There should be a story. And I'm not talking about like marketing talk here, but it's just at the points where things will go really bad and really like south, and you will be willing to give it all up. There should be something like keeping you like afloat. And yeah, I mean, for me, again, at that time I was just alone. So speaking about like team morale and things like that, it wasn't like too many people, frankly, like except me and my family, just kind of believing like, hey, that's gonna work. And I think frankly, like that's the only thing that kept me alive. Just kind of, I did not envision a scenario where this thing will fail. Let's put it this way. And I was telling my spouse at that time, I was chatting with a friend who was also building a startup, and he was like, okay, like he was telling me something in lines with that, like, all right, if this is not going to work, I will go to like that company or that company, and like those are the roles. And like, and I was like, dude, like you're already thinking about scenarios, like assuming something won't go right, which means that you already have, even like you let yourself think there is a chance it's not going to go, like it's not going to happen. While for me, it was like, never, like it's not going to, it won't be an option when this thing will kind of collapse or like not going to work. And I think that's kind of helped me really like to kind of keep up motivation. But I mean, in full transparency, it's building startup. I know it sounds like cliche, but it's tough. It's tough emotionally, first of all, because like within a day you will have like, hooray, we just got like 10 clients and like we got revenues and so on, and then bam, like you're being hit with legal lawsuit, and like, you know, somebody on the team is left, and like things just go so bad, and then you got the customer support when like something is not like working for their clients. So it just will be like roller coaster, and unless you are prepared for that, it will be rough. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think there's been something really nice for myself and Laura, who are in the same cohort at FemTech Lab, for, I think, particularly for some of, we're both co-founders in our companies, but for some of the single founders, you have everything on your shoulder. And so having that community, or having people that will support you as well through that, is hugely important, because sometimes it's just how long can you keep going for to really get that first round of funding. And Laura, with that, I'll turn to you about some of those kind of key strategies that you implemented in order to really help you secure your first yes for Happy's Knees.
I think Alice had a question.
I was just going to tag on just a little bit about, you know, I'm so glad to hear that you have support systems in place, and, you know, it's so important, even in good market times. And what I was going to tag on to was the comments around, you know, when you hear no's, definitely always ask for feedback. And it can be really helpful, because you might hear feedback about, this is, and I'm speaking from the institutional standpoint. I know some of the other comments were about angel investors. But from an institutional VC standpoint, you know, the answer might be it's, you know, it's too early, either stage or for other reasons, in which case, you know, love the business, love the team, keep us on, you know, we'll keep the company on the watch list. So, you know, add us to your newsletter. Or you may get feedback around, you know, I'm not quite sure about the market size or the go-to-market or something about the business fundamentals. And that can give you some food for thought for how you either might tell the story differently, refine your pitch deck and the pitch, and, or if you hear the same thing from multiple folks, then do you want to reconsider some of your part of the strategy for the company or a specific element that you're getting feedback on? So definitely, you know, use that as an opportunity. Other times you might hear this isn't a fit for the fund because maybe it's slightly out of scope, or there's something else that's being prioritized. But again, you know, really positive on the business, positive on the team. Then leverage the opportunity to then ask, you know, who else can you introduce me to? Because now I know I have your buy-in in some way, just not a good fit for this fund at this time. Who else do you recommend? Just a way to turn some of those no's into something useful for you.
Amazing. And Alice, there's been a question from Will about, if you know as a company that you're not quite ready for venture capital yet, is it worth reaching out in order to build up that relationship, or not? What's your sort of advice on that?
Yeah, and you know, there's different ways to approach this. One is there are some investors who really only want to talk if you are doing an active raise today. So that might be the response if you're saying, hey, I would love to get to know, you know, share what I'm doing. You know, we have, I know I've seen you at different conferences, or I know you have an interest in this area. We'll love to share what we're doing broadly as a general networking connection. That is certainly a route. Again, some might say, you know, talk to me when you're actively raising. But in general, it is a good idea to build relationships, because the other flip side is, let's say you're a seed stage company, you know, you should talk to seed investors, but you should actually get to know Series A investors, because, you know, you want to know what milestones they're looking for and what in the future. I think it's just about, you know, being very, you know, thinking thoughtfully about how you contextualize that meeting, whether or not, hey, I have an active raise versus I'd like to share what I'm doing because we have shared interests.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of ways of doing that in a slightly more informal base as well. So, you know, things like networking events where you can go meet people, talk to them, build a relationship, where you can reach out when you're ready, so they know who you are, without organizing a meeting, 30 minutes, take them through a pitch deck if you know that you're not asking for funding. Laura, are there any kind of strategies that you found like that were really helpful as you were sort of looking for your first round?
Yeah, well, again, like our first round was family and friends, and my first investor was my dad, who was so worried I would starve, right? So he just put $20,000 in my bank account, which created a bit of havoc with our lawyer. But having said that, I think I'm going to kind of like shift your question toward something that may be helpful right now. So knowing how hard it is to raise at the moment, and we've been trying to raise around for a while now, and it's all consuming. So when you're raising, you're not doing anything else. So I would suggest founders to consider using their effort in getting traction and developing their market, rather than raising funds, if they can find other ways of sustaining themselves. The conversations we've been having with investors are very revenue oriented at the moment. Is like, look, are you making money yet? If you're not, like, we will not be talking to you. So, or we'll be talking to you, but we will not be investing in you. More like this. So I completely agree with the FOMO comment. It feels like you have to be raising, right? You need to have money in the bank. You have to be raising, and it's like having money in the bank is great, but unless there's some the business is showing traction, that's probably going to be hard. So right now, where there's not a whole lot of capital flowing around, especially in I would say sadly niches like FemTech, I would say spend time developing your market, developing your customers, developing your product, getting it right, getting product market fit, and then go raise. Things will get better. So yeah, don't just like stay in the gap of funding for too long.
Yeah, and also thinking about alternatives for ourselves, we had to be very honest at Thyia in the fact that, okay, venture capital companies are looking at the moment for traction. As a company, we're looking for much broader scale, and so we turned to grants. And actually, a lot of grant writers told us, "Oh, it's not the sort of thing for grants," and they were wrong. I think it's giving that a go, seeing what alternatives are out there. Actually, can you build an MVP that's not the full hog, that only requires kind of a much smaller amount of funding, a smaller raise, in order to push you forward to that next milestone, as you were kind of talking about, Alex. I think where you do have relationships, or say interested angels, people that say they're not quite ready, how, Alex, have you managed to really kind of manage those relationships, to build on them, especially if you secure their commitment? How have you done that?
Yeah, and to be honest, I would just echo what Laura said, because the only way to raise, even let's just create a bit of a context. Like, I've been raising, and I was raising back in 2020. So this is like I believe considered one of the golden years. Like maybe 2021 exceeded it, but like those two were a bit of like insanity, because people were investing in everything that was moving. So I can't say that, I frankly I can't put much emphasis on the relationship with angels, because everyone who invested in us, I didn't know those people, like came completely like absolute strangers. They got to know me over time through multiple calls, but in the end, like strangers. I became much closer to them, after we I started the company, and like I've been updating people on a monthly basis and so on. But then in the beginning, the only thing that makes it like an investing decision for me was the traction. So one of the cool advices that I heard that from YC was, if people see how much things you did in the very short period of time, and they get intimidated by that, that's when like the interest comes up. So for us, just to give the context, like when I first approached the angel, and then when I kind of followed up in a month, like, hey, and gave them like what I've done alone during that time, trust me, it wasn't like the metrics were not, I called 1,000 other angels, right? It was like, what did I do with the product, with MVP, with like getting some customers, getting LOIs, kind of trying and testing the underwriting model and things like that. And people saw that, hey, like he's taking this seriously. He really wants to do something out of it, and he's moving fast. That's what kind of makes those decisions. And I mean, unless we're in Silicon Valley, when people like, if you have those wealthy friends, wealthy angels who exit from their companies, and when people can just give you like 50 to 100K check just because they're your friends, in the end, the investing decision comes down to what have you achieved with your product right now? Like, is your company making money or planning to make money? Is the business model sustainable? Like all the questions that Dennis mentioned in the very beginning, like unless there's clarity in those answers, it will be really difficult. And now it's even more difficult. And I'm not sure, frankly, if it's going to get better, like in the next year or two. I hope it's not going to get worse, but I'm not sure if it's going to get better. And I also, like, as an example, maybe I have a friend right now who is going through his fundraising process. I think he has a pretty cool idea around his product, which is not in the FemTech space, but this is the trade-off that you will always have, especially if you're a solo founder, whether you spend your time on investor calls and like trying to sell the company, or you're writing the code, building the product itself. And it's a very kind of gentle balance that you need to strike, because unless you're pushing the product forward and you're spending all the time talking with people, you might not achieve anything, and then you spend the time, or you spend your own money during this period of time because you need to kind of sustain yourself. So it's very delicate balance, and I don't think I can give like an exact answer, but each of us has to find it kind of independently. But what I definitely know, if you can demonstrate the traction, like it will get much easier in terms of like getting the first checks.
Yeah, there's something I would like to say here. What we found is so our plan was basically capital based. It's like, hey, we're gonna get this funding in, and we will be, developing our network of referring providers, and we'll be automating our support so we can intake more, So it was all based around getting investor, basically capital. And when that didn't happen, we had to get creative, and it actually got really interesting. So we started looking at partnerships, which for me was this fluffy, concept from my corporate life. But it's actually free money. It gives you things that you would have paid for before. So we're talking to a company in the lactation space that has a huge user base, and it's a great acquisition channel for us. We're talking to a sexual well-being company that's looking to develop some curriculum. We have tons of content. There's a licensing opportunity there, right? So when suddenly capital got, hard to reach, creativity kicked in. So I'm just like encouraging all of you guys here who are also trying to raise money and having a hard time at it, to think about different avenues and teaming up. Many of us are working on problems that are unsolved and that take more than one company to solve. So teaming up with companies in your ecosystem that you kind of have like you're complementary with, or sometimes your competitors, right? Besides like benefiting yourself, it actually raises, it's a tide that raises everybody. So just get creative.
Yeah, it's super helpful, Laura, definitely. And I very much mimic that. There are venture capital might be, okay, that's the first thing that you think about, but actually there are lots of other ways that you can do that or get to your milestone. And it means that when you do get to speaking to venture capital companies, you can show the sort of progress you've made, and be very clear on what the funding is required for. And Alice, kind of building on that, I think a big question when people are thinking about funding and the amount of equity that they give away is always confusion around valuation and round value, particularly for your first round. If you don't have any traction, you're not made money, or it's fairly limited. How do you approach that, and what do you expect from startups who are speaking to you?
Yeah, the macro comment is that compared to 2-3 years ago, we are in an environment that is much more investor friendly. So that means from a terms perspective, for deal terms, valuations are, lower than what might have transpired a couple of years ago. For liquidation preferences, there are things like participation that is coming back that like wasn't around And actually that probably isn't even, some of this is not as applicable in that very first round, because a lot of times that first round is raised as a safe or a note, where if it's just a discount, then you avoid thinking about valuation altogether. If there's a cap, a pre-money cap on a convertible note or a post-money cap on a safe, then that is essentially valuation in some way. And yeah, that scale has tipped towards being more investor friendly recently. So the way that this might manifest is, for example, what percent of the company do you sell off in any given round? In the past, you could probably get away with selling 20, 30% of your company in any given round. These days, there are term sheets that might be, 40%. I've even seen 50% or more, especially as you go to the later stages. So, how much stake you sell off in each round, like that, and that's basically a ratio of how much you're raising versus the valuation. That's changed a little bit more recently. I would say, when you think about what should your cap be, or what is what is the valuation in a price equity round, it is a two-way street. Sometimes entrepreneurs will voice what range they are hoping for. In some ways, they might anchor to the last round. That may or may not work, because if you were overvalued in the past, then or valued at that time appropriately, but the markets have shifted, then you might be facing a flat round or a down round. But there are times you can kind of advocate or share what you're looking for. It is a two-way discussion and negotiation, and it would be good to figure out early on if your expectations are just really, really different from where where your lead investor is thinking. This is very timely. I actually gave a fundraising talk with a different accelerator earlier this week, and someone did share in the cohort that they had a lead investor, and things were going on the diligence, they were super aligned, but then when it came down to some of these terms, specifically valuation, they were just too far apart. And she wishes that they had broached that a little bit earlier. In this environment, I would say, you want to take capital if you really need it, rather than shut the company down, for example. So you might end up, just with different options that you would want to creatively consider and really negotiate.
I mean, that's really useful. And do you find that when speaking to companies, I know this will differ from VC to VC, but about there being like a minimum check size and amount that you'd expect somebody to ask as a proportion of that round, what advice would you give there?
So I would separate, I guess, a price round versus a note and a safe. Like, you don't really need a lead for a note or a safe, although sometimes it's helpful to have like an anchor, one of the bigger ones that will actually help set the terms. Usually like, a round will consist of, there's a lead investor or co-leads. In the past, the lead or co-leads together might put in 50% or more of the round. In these creative times, we're seeing not that. We're seeing sometimes leads put in 20%, 35%, a smaller portion, which in the past may have raised my eyebrows, but now again, everyone's just trying to be really creative. So then you need to syndicate and fill in the rest of it. And I've seen entrepreneurs do different things. Some entrepreneurs will take any amount. There's no minimum check size. They get lots of, players in, and they have a very full cap table, which can be, there's benefits, but also just a lot more to deal with, more opinions, more rows on your cap table. it can be complex. And I know others that try to keep it more clean. If you're in the fortunate position of having, a larger check, larger commitments offered, by a smaller number of folks. But that's, it may not be your choice. It may just, you may want to raise a certain amount that you need to reach milestones. So you've got a couple of big checks, but then you need to fill out the rest. And so then you get creative about that. So I don't think there's a right or wrong for minimum check size. It's sort of what's going to be available to you, and what are you open to, working with for complexity.
That's amazing. And I'm now going to just turn it to some of the questions that have been put in the chat, and open each of these up to whoever kind of wants to go. So the first one is kind of, how early did you raise your first round and the traction you had? So either Alex or Laura, who wants to take that one?
So, I mean, from our side, we had MVP, like really a raw version of the underwriting model, because we initially started as a buy now, pay later solution for the wedding space. So we did the like underwriting model, and that's it. So it was time when you you could have raised on the vision and the idea. I'm not sure how it's gonna work now, but that like we were pretty early at that time.
Amazing. Next one, Alice, this is probably to you about sort of the typical profile of an investor interested in FemTech. Who should you be looking for? Because obviously, for a lot of investors, FemTech is not something, or as Laura was saying, it's the diversity of one company. Do you have any recommendations for the right type of investors to look for?
Yeah, I'm of two minds here. On one hand, I think there are unique things about this segment. Some of the issues may not be as well known. There's some stigma attached to some of them. There's marketing restrictions that someone else talked about. On the other hand, I would love to see women's health be considered just as any other therapeutic area, like oncology, like others where you don't need a special investor. And that said, the way I would split the world of funds, there are funds with an explicit mandate in women's health, like ours. There's a handful of them, maybe 6 to 8 globally. And then there are funds that are more generalist that have, don't focus specifically on women's health, but might have it as one out of 3 pillars. And then there's ones that are even broader than that, but do have some kind of emerging interest in women's health. So those are all the investors from the women's health side. But I would also say you should be looking also within your healthcare segment. So if you're a digital health company, who are all the most active digital health investors? If you're a medical device company, who are the serious medical device companies? So, there's kind of the topic area you're focused on, but then there's also healthcare segment, and don't forget about the latter. And I would love a world in which women's health is, just considered as any other area and not so, not so specialized.
That's what we're hoping for. Rather than being a niche, it's half the population. It should be like anything else. It's a huge market. And Laura, next one for you about when you raised that friends and family round, did you have a target to reach? And how did you decide on that target?
Yeah, so we wrote a plan. We knew that having evidence of health outcomes through our intervention was really important. Mm-hmm. So we set that as our goal, and we basically built a plan to get to that evidence. And we knew we needed to test with this many people, build the product to this level, and then there were like a number of regulatory and market access work that had to be done, et cetera, et cetera. So we built a budget, and then we put a number on it, and it was like about $250,000. And then we went and looked at who was in our network, and we said, okay, I think I can get this much from this person, this much from this person. And then we weighted the probability that we would get it. And when we were at about 70% of what we needed, we went out and started pitching. And then everything else came from friends of friends, and like some people we didn't know. It just like we spoke to a provider, and then their like brother showed up with money. So things like that happen. But this is how we went about it. Alice said something interesting about like the kind of profile about the profile of investor that invests in women's health. I think there's something that we found that may be helpful for you guys, which is some investors are focused on FemTech, and investors are focused on health. So there's not those many investors that actually get women's health, because some get women as a target and some get health as an industry, but both together is not so easy. So what we find when you're pitching to funds that target in women founders or women's I would say issues, some of them don't have the depth to understand health and medical. So this is a challenge that you guys should count on when you're in women's health.
And Alice, building on that, you able to let us know a bit about the internal process for deciding whether or not you'd invest in a company?
Sure, yeah. I'll try to keep it brief. So, there's there's usually a screening process, and then the fund decides, should we move forward on into more fuller diligence, and that means that it fits the scope, all the business fundamentals, team, other things check out. It's a high priority area for the fund, and then there will be sometimes a lengthy diligence process, and then in terms of the deciders, every fund is different. There's generally an investment committee. Sometimes it's composed just of the partners. There are some funds that give everybody a vote. Some have external folks on the investment committee that can bring in other expertise. And sometimes the committee has to have a unanimous vote, as in everyone has to agree. So any one person can block it, versus others that need a certain percentage agreement. If you're going to IC, going to committee, that's usually a good, that means a fund has actually spent a lot of time understanding, what you're working on and getting to know you, and so you have a pretty good shot. And for some other funds, anyone along the way, if there's any concerns, or if it doesn't work out, then they'll stop the process. So, making it to IC is generally, a good thing.
Brilliant. And I'm aware there's other questions, but I'm conscious of time. So if you've got those, there's an Ask Us Anything session that I think the link is in the chat to ask some of those other questions. I think for the last minute, I just want to ask each of you in a single line, if you had one piece of advice for everybody here looking to raise their first round, what would that piece of advice be? So Alex, do you want to kickstart?
Yeah, sure. I would just say, don't listen to anyone, believe in your idea, and just keep pushing forward.
Laura, what about from yourself?
Yeah, you're selling them an opportunity. If you're risking your financial stability for the company, this is something you want to share with them too. Do it from a place of power.
And Alice, what about from you?
Sure. I'll just say from the institutional side, give yourself a lot of time. Things are taking a lot longer than they used to. So, think about the time a little bit earlier in terms of what runway you have left, and just all parts of the process are slowing down. So just give yourself ample time.
Amazing. Well, thank you everybody for joining. It's been a fantastic session. And yeah, sign up to the Ask Us Anything session, which will be happening, the link of which is in the chat.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I just want to thank from behalf of FemTech Lab team for moderating today's panel. You were amazing. Guys, don't forget, applications open for our next accelerator program that will be in September, October, and November. Deadline is 14th July, and we just joined our forces with SCT Ventures, so you could learn more on how you can benefit from this merger in the next session. Link is in the chat. See you soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.